Hello there, this is episode 54 of JW Watch, the show that keeps a close eye on all things JW, giving Jehovah's Witnesses a more objective viewpoint on current developments that the governing body almost certainly doesn't want them to hear. Just over a week ago, on July 24th, New Zealand's Abuse in Care Royal Commission of Inquiry was published its findings related to Jehovah's Witnesses, despite multiple legal attempts by Jehovah's Witnesses to either thwart publication or not be involved in the inquiry at all. Now, the full 64-page document is in the public domain and makes for damning reading in its scathing assessment of the group's lack of robust child protection measures and the numerous barriers to disclosure. Joining me to go over these findings is JW Watch team member and colleague Chaka Yumba. Nice to welcome you back to the channel, Chaka.
Hi Lloyd, it's great to be back on the channel, and it's good to be able to go over this damning material, as you said, together with you.
Yeah, absolutely incredible. We were just talking off air. I have a few minor misgivings about the report, which we'll get into, but broadly speaking, it's an excellent report. It's very, very thorough, and really leaves apologists for Jehovah's Witnesses and their child protection measures nowhere to turn to.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, as with the similar things, they are actually referencing the Jehovah's Witnesses literature, such that if you are reading this objectively, even if you're one of Jehovah's Witnesses, you're reading this objectively, you can actually go into those references and find why the Commission does not accept a lot of the arguments that were being made by Watchtower Australia to counter-argue the points that were being raised against them.
I mentioned that the organisation has, been dragged into this sort of kicking and screaming. Are you able to kind of summarise the timeline leading up to publication of these findings?
Right. So what we know from the legal documents that we've been able to look at, as well as the news reports that were presented in the media, is that in the very first instance, the Jehovah's Witnesses, that they would be represented by Christian Congregation of Jehovah's Witnesses of Australasia. That would be the legal entity that would have been representing them in this inquiry. They throughout the commission, they fought not to be part of these inquiries, even though a lot of other religious organizations were included in this inquiry and in the subsequent report. They, as far as we know, they were the only religious organization that actually fought legally not to be included in the report. And the argument that they were making was that they are not a care institution. In other words, they do not have children under their care as a religious or legal entity, a faith-based organization. And they fought this up to literally the very end. And when that tactic did not work, because they kept getting losses in court, when that tactic did not work, what they said was they wanted to see the report. I think that they were given an opportunity, they were definitely given an opportunity to look at the draft report and to give their response, but they wanted to read the final report before it was published, before even the head of the report was looked at it. They wanted to have a look at that. So that did not work for them. They lost that. And in the end, their final thing was to have Jehovah's Witnesses excluded completely from the report that was made public. So it is quite infuriating, especially for an organization that claims to be law-abiding, that says pay back Caesar's things to Caesar, that claims that they are the most honest
Don't insist
people.
on your rights.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a
So
different rule, isn't it, for the organization in
it
general as
is.
opposed to the
Mhm,
individual members? Wow. Okay.
mhm,
Well, yeah, I think that just shows, doesn't it, exactly what we've come to expect from this organization over the years. They really do not like to be scrutinized,
yeah. And
especially not by Caesar, quote
no,
unquote. Go on.
exactly. And I think
Mm.
it would be different if it was only the Jehovah's Witnesses that were being
Mm.
scrutinized in this way. But there was other organizations, not just faith-based organizations, even state organizations. And if you read the report, read the recommendations, there are some damning statements that are made against even the government itself. So
Mm.
they can't claim religious persecution because the state would then be persecuting itself, persecuting all other religious groups. So the only reason I was kind of racking my brains, and I think the only reason why they went in screaming and kicking, they're doing it for the Jehovah's Witnesses. They're putting on a show, they're posturing in front of all
Mm.
the other Jehovah's Witnesses is my only logical conclusion that I could come to as to why go to all this trouble, including the fact that they were actually fined. They were told to pay the legal costs for wasting the court's time in terms of trying to get out of this inquiry.
I don't. I might disagree with you a little bit there because I think
Mm,
my experience is that they like Jehovah's Witnesses to know as little as possible about child
right.
protection, including. I think they won't want any attention at all
Mm,
drawn to what's going on. I remember
mm,
when you'll probably remember when the Panorama, the BBC Panorama
oh, yes.
episode came out in 2002, and they went to the extraordinary length of reading a letter on the Sunday meeting, basically trying to dissuade people from watching the Panorama, which kind of backfired spectacularly. Only made everyone want to
Exactly.
watch it.
Uh,
Yeah, I think they will feel quite emboldened by
mm,
their relative successes with ICSA. And we'll come to
mm,
that a little bit later. Not just ICSA, but also the Charity Commission for England and Wales. You know,
mm,
they they really succeeded, in my opinion, in just
mm,
weighing down the Charity Commission with so much litigation that
mm,
eventually the Charity Commission sort of dropped them like a hot potato.
yeah.
And I think that with ICSA, just the culture in the UK of kind of deference to religion,
Mm-hmm.
which we can go into at another time, but I think that they got off extremely lightly
They did.
with the
They did.
ICSA inquiry, and that's putting things lightly. So I think
Mm-hmm.
that will have emboldened them a little bit. They'll have thought,
Mm-hmm.
well, we've managed to, our legal apparatus has enjoyed some success at least.
Yes.
When we've deployed it in the UK, let's try the same tactic in New Zealand. It's just that
Mm-hmm.
it really didn't work at all in New
It didn't
Zealand.
work at all. And again, for an organization that claims to love children, to have the interest of children at their core, it is very, very infuriating. And I guess we us both being parents, especially, like, why you'd expect that, say, just come on in and want to hear your criticisms, your recommendations, and things like that. But there's just this pushback, and there's just a lack of interest whatsoever to engage with the authorities in any kind of meaningful way. Because I think Jeffrey Jackson in the Australian Royal Commission, when he was dragged screaming and kicking to kind of testify before the commission, he was like, "This is the reason I'm here. My dad is very poorly, but I've decided to come because I want to assist the commission in any way possible." But that's not what you see happening. You see the exact opposite of it, just a zero interest in child protection.
I think in hindsight, if Jeffrey Jackson had his time over, he would have literally kind of like needed to be dragged kicking and
Mm-hmm.
screaming to the camera. I think he would have literally kind of done anything to flee the country rather than
Yeah.
the train wreck that we ended up seeing. Let me
Mm-hmm.
just take a comment before because we're going to look at the case study document or the findings, and it is a 64-page document, so you know fasten your seatbelts, folks. But I am just going to go through some kind of highlights that I've kind of picked out when I was going through it, and we're going to start at the end. We're going to start with the conclusions, which I think most viewers are going to be most interested in, and then for those of you who would like a little bit more information, we'll kind of go to the beginning and we'll kind of go through some of my highlights. Let's just take a comment from my XJW Wake Up. We've seen inquiries in Australia, the UK, and now New Zealand. If the US have some kind of inquiry, it will be game over for Jehovah's Witnesses. Well, of course, there is the Pennsylvania grand jury investigation, although we haven't really heard much from them, have we? Over the past few months, considering things were kind of flowing thick and fast for some period. And I also, I'm not so sure it's quite so much game over, because for me, game over would be, the authorities doing something similar to what happened in Australia, where they just kind of go in and say, give us your documents. And I think that needs to happen on a global level. And unfortunately, we're nowhere near that happening in America. And until it happens in America, and until it becomes the law that you can't cover up abuse, which amazingly it still isn't, I think children will still continue to be put in harm's way. I don't know whether you would concur there, Chaka.
Yeah, I think America, we were saying about the UK being very different to religious organizations. I mean, I've never lived in America, but from what I've read and heard, I think in America it's maybe slightly even more. I think there's definitely parts of America where, there's a very strong Christian religious kind of theme underlying everything. And I think America is maybe a bit of a way away from what's happening in
that's
Australia.
Actually what Jackie Jacks is saying as well. Nothing will happen to them here in the US in an election year. So fair point. Okay, so let me just try and bring up, I'm famously slow and cumbersome on these live streams with selecting or bringing up my the things I want to share, but let's see if this works.
We'll get there.
Okay, I think we're looking now at Chapter 6, Summary of Findings. I'm going to read the whole thing. The inquiry finds that during the inquiry period, elders in the Jehovah's Witnesses held positions of power and had status and authority conferred on them by the faith. The faith assumed responsibility for the care of children and young people placed in the care of elders for witnessing activities, pastoral support, and care, working bees, and other organised events and investigations and judicial committee processes. The working bees thing might not be clear to viewers in the UK. It's not like a very familiar term, but on reading the conclusion, this report, it's clear that what they're talking about is doing work on kingdom halls and that kind of thing. The faith's assumption of responsibility for those children and young people flowed from its conferral of authority and trusted status on elders, and the actions of elders in taking children and young children into their care unsupervised in these contexts. In those situations, children and young people were in the care of the faith. Now, this is a very big deal because, as you know, Chaka, and anyone knows who followed what happened with ICSA, the strategy of Jehovah's Witnesses with ICSA was to absolve themselves of any kind of relevance in terms of ICSA's purview by arguing that there's no situations in which children of Jehovah's Witnesses are in the care of the religion. They say, well, we don't do Sunday kind of schools or anything like that. We don't have any situations where children are solely we don't have any kind of, what's the word, dormitory situations where, children are coming to stay in, overnight or anything like that. So we're not involved in any of this. And what this investigation has done excellently, I think, the New Zealand investigation in particular, is it has taken each and every one of these objections, Chaka, and completely dismantled them. Would that be fair?
Yeah, 100%, because there's they kind of try and say they try and push all the responsibility towards the parents. And as you say, what this inquiry has done is they've looked at those situations and they've actually found out that even though you could argue that the parents had some responsibility, the elders' responsibility, their power and their status and the level of respect that they command means that they actually overrode the parents' authority in a lot of instances. So that was really, really well done.
So for example, they could, Jehovah's Witnesses could say, well, in situations where you go to a meeting for field service and Timmy gets assigned to work with a non-family member while his parents are there at the meeting for field service, having driven the whole family there, it's the parents who are responsible because they are giving the elder permission for Timmy to go and work with this third party, and so they're saying therefore it's the parents' responsibility. But the inquiry very astutely and correctly said, well, of course that's going to happen when elders are given so much trust and respect. Who's going to argue with who realistically is going to argue with the elder and say, no, we object, Timmy's staying with us? Of course, they're going to go along with whatever the elder says. Back to the findings, there is credible evidence that sexual abuse occurred in the care of the Jehovah's Witnesses faith. The practice of elders questioning children or young people who were victims of sexual abuse during investigations and judicial committee processes was inappropriate and emotionally or psychologically abusive. Interesting that the New Zealand investigation included psychological abuse in its remit, so that was taken into account quite correctly.
Yeah, and could I just add on that I think for viewers who've not read this report, but the New Zealand inquiry was quite different from the Australian Royal Commission and the ICSA in the UK, in the sense that it didn't just focus solely on sexual abuse. It just said abuse in care in general. So that could have, as Lloyd has mentioned, that could have meant psychological abuse, it could have meant emotional abuse, other types of abuse, even things like, say, the pressure not to have a blood transfusion. That was also taken into account because they broadened their scope. And this was, I think this was really very well done, because they were taking learning from these other inquiries that have taken place in other countries that were relevant, and then they were building on that.
Indeed. Part D there says there were factors that increased the risk of abuse in the care of Jehovah's Witnesses, including the status of leaders and the power imbalance between them and members of the faith in the context of elevated levels of influence within the faith. The language is just spot on, isn't it, here? The barriers to the disclosure of abuse, including the place of females in the faith, the fear of exclusion and relative disconnection from the secular world, lack of vetting and training of elders in child protection and abuse prevention. I think we might come to it, but it does really drill down into this whole issue of women being completely cut out of the whole process. And even at one point, I think, acknowledges that there's, it's fairly well established now that sometimes people can only, both men and women can only talk about abuse when talking to a female, but women are just completely cut out of the whole process. So the full extent of abuse in the care of the faith cannot be quantified for reasons including inadequate record keeping and the barriers to disclosure described above. This was kind of an interesting difference, because you alluded there to there being differences with the Australian Royal Commission, and my biggest frustration with ICSA in England and Wales was ICSA's reluctance to go after the records. I think what really set Australia apart in its inquiry was the fact that it just took the records, just kind of went in there and said, we're having these records. And from that they were able to get proper data, which is interestingly quoted in this New Zealand investigation. So I find this a little bit confusing where it says inadequate record keeping. There are issues with the fullness of record keeping, and certainly with the destruction of records, particularly elders' notes. But I think, if anything, the fact that Jehovah's Witnesses hoard data on child abuse, that's kind of one of the main issues. And it would have been nice, if I were being ultra critical, if New Zealand could have taken a similar approach to Australia.
Yeah, I think the difficulty they ran into is, it's mentioned, I can't remember in what chapter in this report, but is when the Australian Royal Commission started, they then sent letters to elders to destroy the records and to keep minimum data. And this actually happened when I was still an elder. We just got this letter from the branch saying because there was what's called confidential sealed envelopes. And that's where the reports would be of a judicial committee. And the elders back in the day, the instructions was to write, I don't know if that's your recollection, Lloyd, when you were an elder, but the instructions were to write as detailed a report as possible. But then all of a sudden we got this letter saying those sealed envelopes had to be opened. The letters, the record of the judicial committee had to be destroyed, and then all you left in the envelope was the S77, which just had the details of the individual and the offense they had been disfellowshipped for. So I think this is probably a difficulty they've run into, is that they're a bit late to the party. I think if they went to the Australasia branch, they would be able to find more details, because what happens now, especially in the cases of CSA, is that all the records are kept by the service department. So when there is an allegation established or not, the two elders would speak to the service department. The service department would then write a detailed report of what they've heard, and then they would instruct the elders to destroy any evidence that they have in their possession. So it kind of looks to me like New Zealand inquiry went into the congregations and tried to obtain those records. I think as you rightly say, what they should have done was go to the Australasia branch, which looks after New Zealand, and try to obtain the records from there. I think they would have got a bit further.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think the jurisdictional issues might have been a factor here. But I can't really agree that Jehovah's Witnesses aren't fastidious when it comes to, the last episode of JW Watch that we did went over the form that gets filled in.
Yes.
That gives opportunity for gratuitous details to be included in the report. So that's probably one area in which I would differ slightly. And then point F, which is the final point. Steps taken by the faith to prevent and respond to abuse in care were inadequate. In particular, there was inadequate vetting and training of elders in child protection and abuse prevention. The policies, rules, and that's kind of, I like restrained language. Inadequate. I mean, if we're being honest, it's non-existent, isn't it?
It's non-existent.
It always makes for more credible reading when you use a little bit of restraint.
Exactly.
The policies, rules, and standards relevant to child sexual abuse were from various separate directives from the governing body across many different issues of different publications, all based primarily on passages from Scripture. That's an issue that any inquiry, including future inquiries in future countries, will run into, is that you have the scriptural, what's the word, scriptural viewpoint document, or whatever it's called, on jw.org. You have the Shepherd the Flock of God. You have numerous letters to elders.
Yeah.
You have the July 15th, 2019 Watchtower. If I've got the date right, it might be May or June. So you have...
It's May. It's May, actually.
It's May, sorry. May 15th, 2019 Watchtower. So you have multiple quote-unquote policies rather than just a single policy that says, here's the situation. And whenever you have multiple policies, especially on something as serious as child abuse, you know, people can decide which one they dip from, can't they, in any situation?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And you have the situation where these policies contradict each other. So the elders have to decide which, as you say, which policy they go with. And they will go with either what's in the Shepherd, the Flock of God, invariably, or if they've got some oral direction, because there's also oral direction, which is just said maybe in a kingdom ministry school or something like that. So there's just no transparency. And again,
and ultimately direction from the branch trumps everything, doesn't it? You know, it doesn't matter what's in the documents.
That's it. So you could talk to a guy at the service department and you could say something and you just go by that.
Indeed. And finally, processes for raising, handling and responding to concerns or complaints of abuse in care were inadequate. So those are the kind of the final points. But for those of you who kind of want a slightly more thorough delve into this document, I have actually gone through it with a highlighter. Opens there with some poetry, both in English and in the native New Zealand language. So there you have the contents page. Executive summary. I've highlighted here, during the inquiry period, the faith exercised an elevated degree of influence over the daily lives of members, including how they spent significant portions of their time, the level of education they attained, their relationships and access to certain medical treatments. Two witnesses described themselves as being under the control of the faith, a description the faith disputed. And, you know, I think this is on page 9, really the first actual page of the conclusions, and immediately in point 2, it's got to the whole point, which is the more control you have over an individual, the more likely it is that this sort of thing's going to happen.
Yeah, and it just goes to show how thorough, as we've said earlier, the commission, I don't know if they called it a commission, but it was definitely an inquiry, was in kind of getting to the crux of things. Because I think the Jehovah's Witnesses, one thing they're good at is muddying the waters with any single thing, and they have they speak from both sides of the mouth, where they say one thing to the members and they say a completely different thing to the general public, to secular authorities and things like that. So I think I don't think we can commend them enough for how thorough they were to just read between the lines and get to the bottom of things.
Just cutting straight to the chase there, even in point 2, I think is very impressive. Children and young people were in the care of the Jehovah's Witnesses during faith activities, including door-to-door preaching or witnessing, pastoral support, working bees, and other organised activities and investigation and judicial committee processes. The faith contested whether these situations fell within the inquiry's terms of reference, but the inquiry is satisfied that children and young people were in the care of the faith in these situations for the reasons set out below. And it will go into an exhaustive explanation of why the attempts to kind of squirm out of these terms of reference were given short shrift. Point 4, several factors within the faith increase the risk of abuse occurring during the inquiry period, including the status of elders and the power and influence they exercised, particularly over children and young people. The faith had high barriers to the disclosure of abuse, making it more difficult for individuals to disclose any abuse either to others within the faith or to secular authorities. These barriers included the inferior position of women within the faith, rigid disclosure processes, the fear of being shunned, and the relative disconnection from non-Jehovah's Witnesses, all of which likely prevented or delayed victims from disclosing abuse. There was also inadequate vetting of elders and insufficient training in preventing or responding to abuse. So basically, what we start off with is what we've seen in the conclusion, really, but just, spelled out in a little bit more detail. Let me just scroll down a little bit. Processes for handling and responding to disclosure of abuse of any kind were outdated and ineffective, such as the requirement for 2 witnesses to child abuse. So, again, early on in the document, the 2 witness rule is identified as a major problem.
Yeah, and I think what one of the criticisms they go on to give in this report is that they're taking that from an ancient document, a 2,000-year document, and they're saying they're showing a lack of understanding of how serious this issue is, because you're essentially requiring someone to have a second witness in situations where the situation itself, the nature of the abuse, means there will not be a second person. And so there's just a lack of, it's almost like they refuse to try and understand what type of crime this is, the Jehovah's Witness leadership.
And here again, it refers to the attempts to kind of squirrel out of being held accountable. The Jehovah's Witnesses' approach to this inquiry and to its activities was premised on the basis that no children or young people were ever in its care. The ongoing failure of the faith to recognize that children and young people were in its care gives the inquiry concern about the faith's overall approach to the safety of children and young people in its care during the inquiry period. Again, very nice restrained language there. We're concerned,
We're concerned.
I'm sure many people would have way stronger language to use, but in order for this to be kind of taken seriously by academics and lawmakers and researchers, this is exactly the sort of language they need to be using. Let's just scroll through to my next highlighted point that I wanted to talk about. Former elders who provided evidence to the inquiry noted that Jehovah's Witnesses are taught to believe that elders are appointed by the Holy Spirit and are strongly encouraged to cooperate with what they say. The faith says the requirements for being appointed to be an elder are set forth in the Bible, inspired by the Holy Spirit. This was funny to me because it's just common knowledge, isn't it, among Jehovah's Witnesses that the reason why we should, or Jehovah's Witnesses should respect elders, is because they are appointed by Holy Spirit. Yeah. They're even called appointed men.
Exactly. Spirit-appointed men.
Spirit-appointed men. So, and a spirit-appointed man is an elder or a ministerial servant.
Yes.
And the reason why they are spirit-appointed is because they are appointed by Holy Spirit. And they've even tried Jehovah's Witnesses, because it speaks there of the faith says, they've even tried to squirrel their way out of that very simple fact.
And yeah, I think this is the most irritating thing about the Jehovah's Witnesses, because the expectation for ordinary Jehovah's Witnesses is you have to be proud of your faith. Even if you're a young child going to school, you are told you have to stand up, you have to identify yourself as one of Jehovah's Witnesses on the first day, you have to proudly talk about your beliefs. But when the religion is in a secular context, you find them like literally denying their own belief system, which is just utterly ridiculous.
Yeah, I mean, you would think that if it's what they genuinely believe, that they would have kind of the cojones to kind of say, yeah, this is what we believe,
Exactly.
But what's being projected here is just a a spirit of just denying everything. You know,
Mm-hmm.
you've got to just give a little bit of ground. You know that you can surely give some ground in admitting to teachings that are literally in your publications. You know, but
Yeah.
there we go.
I don't know, like, I don't know if you've ever had anyone who's got a legal background and is trained in American law. It seems to me like it's like an American legalistic way of just trying to just play on words and just like muddy the water so that you can get out of things.
Semantics, yeah.
Yeah.
Just trying to negate absolutely every possible line of attack against them seems to be what they're trying to do here. Just scrolling a bit further down, and by the way, we have had a comment. I will try and show more comments during the course of this live stream. Sherry asks, Lloyd, will you have a copy of this document available? It is available online. Apologies that my description doesn't yet have any. I've just said more details to follow, but there will be, if you, once this is broadcast and I've had the time to write a nice kind of keyword-friendly description for the live stream, I will put down. I will put a download link for sure, and you'll be able to go over this in more minute detail. I'm just kind of skimming through points that I really wanted to kind of that I found interesting.
Yeah, and if I can just mention for anyone who wants to look it up really quickly, it's abuseincare.org.nz. or NZ for people in America.
Fantastic. Hang on a moment. I feel like I should put a banner up. Can you repeat that for me?
So that was abuse in care, all as one word.
Yeah.
.org.nz.
.nz. Scroll across bottom. Add banner. Hang on, is that showing? Show.
Oh,
there we go.
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, visit this website, and you'll almost certainly find the document. But I will put a more direct link in the description later. So moving on with my thoughts. So you had this quote here. Being part of the faith is considered a pathway to salvation and to escape the perils of an imminent Armageddon. And then it says, a conflict that signals the end of Earth's history. You know, you and I were talking about this before we went on air, Chaka, and I was explaining how any kind of statement that isn't factually bulletproof will be pounced upon by Jehovah's Witnesses as an opportunity to dismiss the entire document. And I just feel like the wording here wasn't exactly kind of bulletproof, because Jehovah's Witnesses would argue that Earth's history doesn't end, it just changes radically, you know.
Exactly.
So that was a little bit disappointing in an otherwise expertly worded document. The investigation found that those who do not participate in the preaching work are considered to be blood guilty. Due to the belief in Armageddon, those who do not preach are seen as withholding life-saving information from their fellow humans. The study concluded that shunning, this is an American study, concluded that shunning threatens 4 basic social needs: belonging, self-esteem, control, and meaningful existence. It removes a person from their identified group, threatening belonging, and creates feelings of inadequacy and self-doubt, threatening self-esteem. I really loved, Chaka, the way they really grounded and established the credibility of their findings using as many external academic sources as possible. And it refers here to an investigation. If you look down, scroll down to the footnotes, you'll see there it's actually a study by Luther R. What happens to those who exit Jehovah's Witnesses? An investigation of the impact of shunning, Pastoral Psychology 2023. So
Very recent.
that's how up to date. I didn't even know that this study existed, and the
Yeah.
New Zealand inquiry is right on top of things, you know.
Yeah.
And what an important conclusion to reach, that it's not just the shunning, it's also the sense of existential dread
Yes.
that keeps people locked inside Jehovah's Witnesses.
Yeah, and this is like a it's in a peer-reviewed journal.
Who can argue with that? You know,
Pastoral
it's
psychology. So, this is legit stuff.
they're not quoting the Lloyd Evans channel or anything
No.
shady like that. You know,
No.
they're going straight for the academics.
Yeah, although they wouldn't be too far wrong if they did.
Of course, only the finest information on this particular channel, as my viewers know. So then on point 29, it says, former elder Shane Metchen told the inquiry, when young people are disfellowshipped or shunned, their whole support system is taken away. Some leavers are so impacted by being separated from everything they know that they become suicidal. Again, very, very important point to note. And it's really, really important to note the existential dread issue and shunning issue, in the context of, again, barriers to disclosure and what keeps people, terrified of saying anything that might get them in trouble.
Yeah.
Becoming a Jehovah's Witness, some members the inquiry heard from joined the faith during particularly vulnerable periods in their lives. For example, when they had been recently widowed or were in financial difficulty. And then there's a scathing quote from a Jasmine Grew, who says that Jehovah's Witnesses prey on people who are most vulnerable. They give false hope. They provide the vulnerable with a community and a family and a sense of belonging. They work their way into your life so the relationship becomes very tight. Uncompromising, scathing language, but hard to argue.
Hard to argue. I don't remember seeing them even trying to counter-argue this point, because you actually have training. There is a video by the former coordinator of the United States branch, Leon Weaver, where he actually talks people through step by step how to get people who are vulnerable into the religion, and it's on jw.org. So how can they argue against that?
Well, I think it was the 2019 Love Never Fails convention where they show a video of shot in England, our home turf, Chaka, shot in England, of going round and encountering an angry man. And then the father relates to his son about he was once angry.
Yes.
But it was when a friend of his died that he was more agreeable to receiving the message. So again, you're talking about actual materials that promote doing this, that promote exploiting emotional vulnerability.
100%, yeah.
So the next point I wanted to discuss, Chapter 3, care provided by the Jehovah's Witnesses in, is it terrible that I can't pronounce that? Aotearoa, New Zealand.
Is that I don't know if there's anyone from New Zealand in the chat, the live chat, but is that the word for New Zealand in Maori?
I think it might be. I think it might be. But
so I think you'd be safe just to say New Zealand if that's the case. But
okay, I'm going to say New Zealand, but I intend no disrespect whatsoever, particularly as a British person who's very sensitive to our colonial past, and the fact that the British Empire screwed over huge portions of the world. Please do not take any insult from the fact that I'll be referring to this as New Zealand. Introduction. Unlike most other faith-based organizations the inquiry investigated, the Jehovah's Witnesses did not provide faith-based schools, children's homes, or foster care services. That's what I meant, children's homes, when I was saying dormitories, during the inquiry period. However, the faith did provide pastoral care and other informal forms of care, pastoral care includes spiritual, social, emotional, and material support or guidance for individuals or communities. It can also include visiting, counselling, religious counselling, including Bible studies or other faith activities, or otherwise helping people in the congregation. The faith also assumed the responsibility for the care of children and young people in other situations, such as witnessing, door-to-door preaching. So I think this whole section is where they kind of really nail down. They really drill down on this whole on debunking this claim that Jehovah's Witnesses don't have anything to do with looking after children. And I can remember when I was giving my evidence to ICSA, I identified 4 or 5 ways in which Jehovah's Witnesses do insert themselves in situations where they are one-on-one with children, or they're with children and the parents aren't there. And one of those, and I acknowledged in the document, no longer existed at that particular point. But do you remember the Pioneer Assist program?
Oh, yes.
That was, and that was within fairly recent history.
Yeah, I think did they not stop it in the 2010s or something like that?
They stopped it in the 2010s, but they had for at least a period a situation where elders would assign pioneers to assist an assigned person, could be a child, could be a minor, to encourage them to become pioneers. So there again, you have people being paired off with other people's children.
And I think one of the arguments they make, I don't know if it's one of your highlighted points, and I'm sorry if I'm rushing ahead a bit, is there is this argument around when parents ask someone in the congregation to study with the children. And the argument that the Christian Congregation of Jehovah's Witnesses Australasia make is that is a decision that's made by the parents, and the parents select the individual that studies with their child. But that's not the case. It's explicitly stated in not only in the Shepherd book, but even if you go on Watchtower Online Library in Kingdom Ministries, it's the Congregation Service Committee that decides that, first of all, they have to give that go-ahead of whether someone else can study with the child of a witness, and then they actually assign who that individual is. But then they just blatantly lie about that. And thankfully, the inquiry did not buy into those lies.
Indeed. We have a super chat from Ivan Ramos, long-time viewer of the channel. Hi, Ivan. The real reason the authorities are hunting down the witnesses in their dumb bunker videos is because that's where they're hiding all the files of those child predators. Oh, I mean, look, we need to laugh or we'll cry. But yeah, look, it's tragic, isn't it? How messed up all of this is, and I do appreciate your support of the channel. We have a message from Amy Roman. This is my first live stream. I just want to tell you both that you have been pivotal in my waking up process over the last 6 months, binging both your accounts. Thanks so much for high quality content. Chaka, in a matter of a few months, you've gone from being an elder to being pivotal in someone's waking up process. So let that sink in, if you will, for a moment.
Kind words,
and I must just give thanks to Crit Dice, who is giving me the pronunciation Aotearoa. Yes, it is the Maori name. So when I'm going to try and include that Aotearoa. And thank you for educating me in that regard, because, again, I am acutely aware of the colonial past of New Zealand and the way its peoples have been mistreated. So thank you for that clarification. So just returning to the document, if I just scroll down further, I'm going to come to my next highlighted point. Here we get to the litigation. So they've included in the findings a summary of the litigation. In litigation in 2023 and 2024, the Jehovah's Witnesses challenged the inquiry's interpretation of the phrase "where a faith-based institution assumed responsibility for the care of an individual" as well as the amendment to the terms of reference, the High Court and Court of Appeal dismissed those challenges, and at the time of writing, the Jehovah's Witnesses had sought leave to appeal to the Supreme Court. The Jehovah's Witnesses also filed a judicial review application in late June 2024 and sought access to this case study before it was presented to the Governor General. The High Court dismissed the application for access to the case study in advance of its presentation to the Governor General. You know, again, I don't know whether there are any Jehovah's Witnesses watching, but it's pretty shameful, isn't it, that they would, you know, if they genuinely believe that their child protection policies are, you know, are sound, why would they be jumping through so many hoops to stop them being scrutinized by a governmental authority?
Exactly, and it's the hypocrisy, because just watching your recent rebuttal to the convention, you covered one of the talks where they were basically telling people, elders included, to be open to criticism and that sort of thing. Like, we can always improve whatever thing we do, whatever aspect of life, like, work we're involved in. There's always room for improvement, but to them, it's always, it seems that they're not open to any kind of criticism or feedback or anything that can, even if they had like robust policies, you cannot say there's no room for improvement, because even as we've said earlier, even the government itself allowed this inquiry to investigate state institutions, but that's not the case with the Jehovah's Witnesses.
Indeed. Just scrolling down further, the evidence before the inquiry shows that at times when witnessing, children and young people also accompanied elders who were not from their family. You know, this goes back to them trying to squirrel out of having any accountability. And, you know, you and I, Chaka, can think of many instances where, as ministerial servants or elders, we paired children off with non-family members, or found ourselves working with children who weren't our children. And I can remember acutely having to work with children who were being homeschooled. And it was, I was going around houses with someone else's kid when they should have been in school. And one of the householders quite rightly said, "Why are you bringing this child on my doorstep when she should be in school?" Had no answer.
What could
I
you
had
say
no
to
answer to
Lloyd?
that.
Yeah.
The things they made us do, Chaka.
Exactly.
The things they made us do.
Yeah, and the thing is as well, they wouldn't acknowledge this, of course, but to have your child work with an elder is viewed as a privilege. It's like a prestigious thing in the organization, and parents want that to happen. So again, it goes back to what the inquiry have picked up on, or the fact that the elders have this status, this authority in the congregation. You could say they have this soft power, which actually translates into real power.
Indeed. Just scrolling further down to my next talking point, 2 former elders said that during weekly witnessing activities, Jehovah's Witness children were paired up with elders and other adult members from outside their family. I think we've kind of established that by now, that really did happen. This was a point that kind of grated a little bit. You know, I appreciate Jasmine Grew sharing her evidence, but it says here, Jehovah's Witnesses use their children to win people over so they can extend the conversation at the door. Children must say something during the witnessing procedure. Again, if I'm looking at this from a strictly objective point of view, and I'm trying to kind of be absolutely fact-based, I think it's a little bit dubious to suggest that that's how children are used. I'm sure perhaps on some subconscious level that might happen in some instances, but I'm not sure. I'm not confident you can say that in kind of like a blanket way, if that makes sense.
No, I think you're 100% spot on, and that seems to be like a low blow.
Yeah, but you know, and I don't want to in any way disparage Jasmine Grew, because I'm very, very grateful for what she contributed to the inquiry. I think it's incredibly important that people like her and others who gave evidence step forward. but I'm purely thinking about this from the point of view of wanting this document to be as absolutely bulletproof as it possibly can be. So point 44 says, if an elder, let me just read it in context a little bit. If an elder who happens to be present suggests to a parent that their child could accompany another family witnessing, then that suggestion... Oh, this is an objection given by Jehovah's Witnesses.
Yeah.
So they say, the faith said, that if an elder who happens to be present suggests to a parent that their child could accompany another family witnessing, then that suggestion, A, is not part of the policy or practice of the faith, B, is not an example of the faith-based institution assuming responsibility for the care of the child, as the child in this scenario is with another family as a result of the decision and consent of their parents. That's the sort of hair-splitting that they've resorted to in their efforts to squirrel out of accountability in this area.
It is extremely disappointing because how many talks are given, even demonstrations are given. I think it's only 2 conventions ago where you had this sister that was basically pairing herself with another sister all the time, and it was kind of, she was shamed for doing that, and then she had to cooperate with the person that's taking the lead and deciding who works with who. So how is it a suggestion? How is that a suggestion when, if you don't follow the suggestion, you're seen as not cooperating with the elders who have been appointed by Holy Spirit? Therefore, you're not cooperating with Jesus, the head of the congregation. So
Of course, you're going to go along with whatever the elder suggests, and you would be terrified of, saying, actually, no, brother, we'll make our own decisions here, thank you. That's going to end well, isn't it? This was interesting. So this was a statement, the faith-provided statements, you'll see there, from current members. So this is a statement that they have provided, that Jehovah's Witnesses have provided. And I couldn't help but laugh when I read down and this kid says, honestly, most occasions I would have rather stayed at home watching television.
This made me laugh as well when I was reading through it.
You know what? And you know what? I bet the lawyers read that part and thought, we'll include it just because we want to make it look as impartial as possible, But good grief, even in what they're submitting to the inquiry, we're seeing that children are feeling pressured into doing this,
Yeah, it reminded me of when they had this expert witness in the Australian Royal Commission, and then she just unraveled and she basically testified against them, under the slightest bit of scrutiny from, was it Angus Stewart? She just unraveled, and she was.
But in all seriousness, this is the problem that you have when you're frankly just wrong. If you're in these situations where you're having to give evidence in front of any kind of legal process, especially an inquiry, it helps when you're just right.
Exactly.
And when you're wrong, and you're desperately scrambling to cover up the fact that you're wrong. It's like playing whack-a-mole, trying to keep things consistent, isn't it? So let's just
end well.
It won't. Taking into account all the available evidence, the inquiry finds that during the inquiry period, the Jehovah's Witnesses assumed the responsibility for children and young people placed in the care of elders other than their parents for witnessing activities. So again, just really making that point crystal clear. I think that's what is also referred to. I'm just going to scroll through some of this because it's, again, just asserting that point unequivocally. And then it goes into this same level of argumentation or drilling home this point with Bible studies and the fact that elders would be involved in arranging Bible studies with children and young people. Again, it says here, children and young people in those situations were within the care of the faith. Again, the absence of specific authorizing documents does not alter this conclusion, because that's something they were saying was, well, we don't have a specific policy saying that this is what elders should do. Well, that's not an excuse, because all we need is a few people coming forward and telling us that this is their experience, and you're in trouble, you know. Working bees and other organized activities, again, so this is talking about situations such as Kingdom Hall maintenance and that sort of thing. This was an interesting one. Investigations and judicial committees. All baptized members are considered accountable to the faith and can face formal judicial action for any wrongdoing. The age for baptism varies, but it is an option from about the age of 10. I would have said 6 or 7.
Yeah, where did they get that number from?
Yeah.
We've had Gerrit Losh come on camera bragging
Gerrit
about
Losh literally did a JW Broadcasting
Yeah.
episode where he talked about 7 being the age. And I think if you dip into the publications, you can find one as young as 6. So, but hey, I'd rather them go higher than lower,
True.
you know?
True.
I'd rather them err on the side of caution.
100%,
Again, the most important thing for me is that this document is weighty in its conclusions and in its credibility. The Jehovah's Witnesses told the inquiry that where there is a serious allegation, elders never interview children and do not take children into back rooms to cross-examine them, and that there has always been a policy to that effect. The faith said that judicial committees only interview parents. Thoughts, Chaka?
I was tearing my hair off when I read this particular paragraph. Like, again, like the Jehovah's Witnesses lie even when they don't have to lie. The leadership, that is. So when we talk about the Jehovah's Witnesses, we mean the leadership, not the ordinary members. Why not just say, like, up until recently, they've had this policy. They had that policy in their elders' manual where children were investigated. They were even subject to judicial committees up until, I think, the 2016 update of the elders' manual. So why not just say, yes, this was our policy in the past, but upon further scrutiny and whatever feedback, we've decided to update that policy, and that doesn't happen. But the other thing as well, when they say elders never interview children, that is not true, because even the current policy, it does not preclude interviewing children. What it says is if the elders feel that there is a need to speak to the child, they should speak to the service department, and then the service department will make a ruling as to whether the child will be spoken to. So it's just lie upon lie, and extremely frustrating and infuriating that they just will not cooperate.
I'm pretty sure that in this same document, it alludes to the fact that in the Shepherd book, the testimony, when it comes to the testimony of children, elders should ask, does it have the ring of truth?
Yes.
So even in this same document, it's got literal written proof that children are interviewed by elders. And you're right. I mean, they did, to their credit, update their policy relatively recently to the point where children aren't interviewed separate to their parents. And that's something that if you're reading the May 15th, 2019 Watchtower article, you're going to see it in there, that children are never going to be spoken to away from their parents, or they're never going to be put in situations where they're made to confront their abuser. But that says nothing about all the years where they were put in those situations.
Exactly.
You know?
Exactly. Yeah.
And that needs to be taken.
Yeah. It does, in this sorry to interrupt you, but to just say we never interview children, like, that was kind of heartbreaking.
And I love the brevity of this statement. The inquiry has not been directed to any specific policy relating to investigations or judicial committees during the inquiry period. So in other words, they've told us this, but they've been unable to actually give us any written proof to substantiate what they're saying. Let's just take lots of comments coming in. Thank you so much to everybody that's tuning in. Narcissists are master gaslighters, says Jackie Jacks. Agree 100%. Sherry says, I watch Aaron Smith Levin's videos in growing up in Scientology, so similar in some ways as a cult. He always leads his videos off with every day is a good day not to be in a cult. Crit Dice says, as a New Zealand ex-Jehovah's Witness here, we know firsthand of a case that happened of someone that had done sexual abuse to minors in the Congo. It split the Congo in half when the parents of the victim went to the police. We cannot wait for all of this to come out.
Interesting.
Very interesting, yeah. Beauty Rest says Watchtower is very skilled to maneuver themselves out of trouble. I'm not sure they're even all that skilled, you know. It's just
a lack of sense,
frantic thrashing around, you know. But yeah, they definitely do try and get out of trouble. Sherry T says, when my son was young, I asked for an elder or ministerial servant to have a Bible study with him. They refused. My then husband was worldly and in law enforcement. In hindsight, that was very telling. Yeah, I think that's probably why they backed off a little bit there. This is in reference to what you were saying. My ex-JW wake up. I haven't any hair left to tear. Mine's come out in clumps thanks to this horrendous organisation. So that's just bringing us up to date a little bit with the comments. It's nice to see currently 121
very nice
watching the live stream, despite other live streams going on in the XJW sphere, we heard in our team talk before. Okay, so let's go back to the document. I'm just going to scroll down to my next point that I found interesting. So this is in the chapter 4, risk factors and allegations of abuse in the care of the Jehovah's Witnesses in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Several features give rise to an increased risk of abuse in the care of the Jehovah's Witnesses during the relevant period. They include the status of leaders and the power imbalance between them and members of the faith in the context of elevated level of influence within the faith, the barriers to the disclosure of abuse, including the place of females in the faith, the fear of exclusion and relative disconnection from the secular world, inadequate vetting and training in abuse prevention for elders. So that's kind of reiterated, you could say, throughout the document, both at the beginning, in the middle, and at the end.
Shall we just stop on paragraph 78? I don't know why I've got a note on paragraph 78. I think it's towards the end. Yeah, towards the end of paragraph 78.
Yeah.
This is an argument around whether Jehovah's Witnesses are kept separate from worldly people, so to speak. And their counter-argument was, the faith submits that the scripture teaching to be no part of the world does not mean that Christians isolate themselves from the world. Rather, they must not participate in practices that one may find in society, such as crime, cruelty, oppression, and dishonesty. But what the witnesses submitted was around things like Christmas, birthdays, extracurricular activities, and those sorts of things. And then they're just muddying the waters and saying, well, when we talk about being no part of the world, we're talking about not being involved in crime, cruelty, oppression, and dishonesty. So,
yeah. To be honest, this part of the document I found kind of a bit awkward to read, because I think there were I had issues on both sides, if I'm being completely honest, because, like, for example, it says, let me see here, this is and again, I don't wish to in any way demean those who are giving evidence, but it says, Naomi Burnett said, I remember that when I went to school, my parents took me there and always reminded me what my religion did not allow me to do at school. For example, Easter celebrations and traditions, Christmas decorations, no standing up for the national anthem. I think that I think it's important to kind of delineate between separateness from the world and religions having particular requirements that involve them for religious reasons to abstain from certain religious observations, which is what we're talking about here. And I think there's a big difference between the two. So again, I'm trying to. I want this document to be as bulletproof as possible, and I don't. And what apologists tend to do, such as that apologist in Italy, what's his name, that's used by nearly all the cults.
The one that defended
Massimo Introvigna, I think
it.
his name is. You know, that they will leap on any perceived attempt to rob Jehovah's Witnesses or other cults of their religious freedoms. And I think Jehovah's Witnesses have the religious should have the religious freedom to abstain from things like Christmas and Easter and those things. So I guess I would have liked a little bit more nuance on this subject, I think, is what I'm saying. Yeah,
I get your point, but I'm just from the Jehovah's Witness perspective, isn't that part of being not part of the world? The fact that you don't engage in politics, in nationalistic holidays. But why my beef with this is, why are they denying that that's not an aspect of being not part of the world?
Yeah,
I appreciate
their modus operandi is to just deny everything, isn't it? Just deny, even if it's something where they actually do have the latitude to take a stand and say, yes, this is who we are. This is we're proud of this, you know.
Exactly. And that is the expectation of on Jehovah's Witnesses, even the youngest Jehovah's Witnesses, to take pride in these beliefs.
Quotes from Jasmine Grew. Miss Grew told the inquiry that this belief regarding a paradise earth was ingrained in you from birth, and that fear is instilled in members from day one. The only way to avoid being killed in the godly retribution of Armageddon is to follow the guideline of the Bible in thought and actions as prescribed by the leaders of the Watchtower organization. Hard to argue with that. That's 100%. It's putting it very, very bluntly, but it's accurate. You know, this is where I think witness evidence is so important, because when the inquiry is wording its conclusions, it needs to exercise restraint, but it's helpful to kind of counterbalance that with the practicality and the reality, and with the kind of not mincing words. So it's nice to see that that's included. Just scrolling down a little bit. Oh yeah, this was a weird one for me. Miss Oakley also explained how Jehovah's Witnesses had limited access to information, that she wasn't allowed to use the library and only had old encyclopedias. I would suggest it would be fairly rare for a Jehovah's Witness child to be said, don't go, to be told, don't go anywhere near the library. You know, when I was brought up, I was taken to our local library by my mum, you know, and encouraged to read. So this was just another area in which, again, I worry about Jehovah's Witnesses reading it and thinking, oh, that's not accurate. This was an interesting one, or at least to me it was. Jasmine Grew saying that engagements were to be short.
I think that's Miss I. Is that Miss IU?
Sorry, Miss IU. Yeah. Okay. Thank you for correcting me. Yeah. I'm not. I mean, I guess anecdotally you could say that's true, but I don't think that there is guidance to that effect in the publications, is there?
No, I don't think there is any official policy, and I don't think we've seen anything on video or even comments by the leaders to that effect.
If you were engaged to someone and it ran into like years and years, I think it would cause a few ruffles within the congregation, but I don't think that there's anything that any elders could point to and say, you know, you're in trouble here, you know. Let me just scroll again, just trying to be as super objective as I possibly
I think that's the best way to go.
yeah trying to destroy the stereotype of apostate. The level of influence this is in point 91, the faith exercised over members in the inquiry's view increased the risk of abuse in care during the inquiry period. Power imbalance and status, together with elevated levels of influence, created a greater risk that abusers could misuse their power to perpetrate abuse and silence those they abused. And then it starts talking about barriers to the disclosure of abuse. I guess I kept wanting, when I was getting this far in the document, and we're now kind of at the halfway point, I was wanting it to. So it's the same. It was the same when I was involved with ICSA as a core participant. For me, I was all about the database. It's like the Australian Royal Commission started with the database and went from there. That's the way it should be done. And so I'm reading this document and I'm thinking, when are they going to start talking about the database? You know, and then it starts talking about inflexible disclosure processes. And so that's where it starts to allude to that. But when it's saying inflexible, it's talking about how they do have a disclosure process of sorts. It's just very, very limited and very, very inflexible.
So for example, you can't disclose to a female and then have that female investigate that complaint or allegation. It has to be two men.
This was a statement that again just jarred me a little bit. The effect of being brought up as a Jehovah's Witness was this: as a young adult and older, I believed I was secondary to men and boys, and that I had to do what they said, especially older men, especially white men.
Why the white men was kind of my question when I was reading.
Everything that was being said there, I agreed with right up until, and that's not to say that there isn't a disproportionate amount of power with white men at governing body level. You know, if you look at the total lack of diversity on the governing body, but I think, you know, when you play the race card in any kind of in such a sensitive area as this, you want to do it with absolute accuracy. And I'm not 100% sure it's being accurately played here.
I think there's that slight danger that it would undermine the rest of which is a good argument. And I just wonder whether they haven't identified their name. This could be a person from a minority background, understandably, and that's probably where they're coming from. But the lack of context just creates a bit of difficulty.
But again, this isn't to in any way disparage those who've come forward and given evidence. I'm just trying to kind of do my job and be as objective as I possibly can be, and weigh the kind of the strength of this document as something that I'm hoping will inform kind of lawmakers and researchers in, you know, for decades to come. Point 100, overseas inquiries have found that female and male abuse survivors will not always be comfortable disclosing abuse or speaking with a male about abuse. This is what I was referring to earlier, and it's a really important point. Failure to accommodate a survivor's preference can further traumatize them or prevent disclosure. This is not only referring to the fact that women aren't involved at all in the child protection process, but I also like, Chaka, that it's bringing in overseas inquiries and making their findings part of their findings.
I thought this was good because they're, you know, the expression, don't reinvent the wheel. So they're kind of like going, okay, what has already been established and how can we build on what's been established? So I think that was really well done. I just had a slight comment on paragraph 99 just before you go there.
Okay.
Just the last bit there that's on the screen. There's this report that inquiry has uncovered, and these are the elders' concerns. It says the elders all felt great shock at the seriousness of the sin, the repercussions to the congregation should the girl become pregnant and the sin thus become known.
Ugh.
That was their concern. That was
Oh
their
no!
concern when a
What if she actually? What if she
15-year-old
has a
girl.
baby?
Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's really damning, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Good catch. Good catch. There's also a report that forms part of the inquiry that notes disclosure processes need to be flexible, trauma-informed, and survivor-focused, which requires flexibility about how victims of sexual abuse disclose abuse and to whom. That was not the case for the processes in the Jehovah's Witnesses during the inquiry period, which in the inquiry's view contributed to the risk of abuse in care. This is what we were saying before about flexibility and how it really needs to be survivor focused. And with Jehovah's Witnesses, it's unmistakably either it's primarily organization focused and secondarily abuser focused, you could say.
Abuser focused.
Let's scroll down a little bit more. Again, please don't take what I'm saying or my little highlights as the be all and end all. A link to the whole document will be available and is available on the link that you're seeing on the banner below on this screen. Witnesses explained the deep impact of shunning, which inevitably fed into the fear that prevented the disclosure of abuse. And I think that's one of the things that I was so grateful for with the Australian Royal Commission. I vividly remember, you were still a witness when that was happening, but I remember when they were really drilling down into shunning. And I knew kind of intuitively why they were doing it. But part of me was thinking, Jehovah's Witnesses are going to be saying, what shunning got to do with it? We're talking about child abuse. But this just very, again, succinctly and in a very well-worded way explains why shunning is absolutely related to child abuse.
And I think that was one of the main highlights of the Australian Royal Commission, the exchange between Angus Stewart and Jeffrey Jackson, where Angus Stewart basically says, well, it's a captive organization, isn't it? And Jeffrey Jackson tries to kind of push back on that, but then Angus Stewart presents all this evidence that, somebody effectively could be trapped in this organization when they've been abused because of the fear of being shunned.
Yeah, absolutely. So just scrolling down further. So this is referring to the Royal Commission. Australia's Royal Commission found that the Jehovah's Witnesses practice of shunning members who disassociate from the organisation had the very real potential of putting an abuse survivor in the untenable position of having to choose between the re-traumatization of having to share a community with their abuser or losing that community altogether, which again, is something you just don't think about as a Jehovah's Witness, that if you're in this situation, let's say that even the police are involved early on and that your abuser gets disfellowshipped straight away. Well, at some point, he's going to get reinstated, if that's what he wants to happen. And at that point, you're then in a situation where twice a week, you've got to sit in the same room as him or her. And so you can understand why some people would want to just get out of the organization, because even just the thought of running into them at a convention would be too much, if they get moved to another congregation. So... in short, the inquiry has no doubt that the fear of being shunned was a barrier to the disclosure of abuse in care and increased the risk of abuse occurring in the care of the faith during the relevant period. And then it touches again on this aspect of relative disconnection from people outside the faith and from secular authorities. The relative insularity of the Jehovah's Witnesses and their distrust of government agencies meant that issues were commonly dealt with internally. I wouldn't say commonly dealt with, I would say always dealt with internally, because it's ultimately the branch that that acts as the gatekeeper and gets to decide how abuse should be handled. And this also reminded me of what we heard literally at this year's convention, where Gage Flegel in the dramatic Bible reading was talking in very negative terms about human governments.
Yes, what did he say? Human governments is insulting to Jehovah.
They're an insult, yeah. He really didn't mince his words, so
Shocking.
all of this, again, you don't really connect the dots when you're a Jehovah's Witness. But this is why we need, inquiries and people who care about this subject to just connect all of these things and understand how the teachings and the theology and the culture all contribute towards this epidemic of abuse within Jehovah's Witnesses. We were taught that those outside our Jehovah's Witness religion were bad people, including the government. This another piece of evidence from a witness. Again, I'm sure that the person saying this will have felt this, passionately. But I just have to kind of say that I don't think that that's the actual teaching, that everybody is quote unquote a bad person, including the government. I think that there is perhaps a little bit more nuance.
Indeed.
To be added there, but again, this is true to the person saying it, and I'm sure, hopefully, when people are reading it, they'll take that into account. Point 119: the evidence received by the inquiry is consistent with a study from the United Kingdom, which found that at an early stage of an individual's involvement with the community, the person is encouraged to live separate from mainstream society, with minimal interaction from outsiders, including family members who are not Jehovah's Witnesses. And then again, we have an external, peer-reviewed piece of academic research from named professionals. It's down there in the footnotes. Shunning from the Jehovah's Witness community, is it legal? Journal of Law and Religion. I want to look that up now. Again, I just didn't know it existed. Did you know that? I mean, I didn't know that even existed. So
I didn't know that. This would be an interesting to read through that. And this is like in the Cambridge University Press, no less.
Yeah, who knew? Who knew the Cambridge University had done studies on shunning among Jehovah's Witnesses? So, really, really impressed with, well, first of all, Cambridge University, well done, folks, but also for the researchers and investigators in this inquiry for really doing their job, and really looking into what information is available from an academic point of view, because if they'd have asked me, what academic research is there, I would have kind of shrugged my shoulders and said, to be honest, not enough, but there is some, at least. There is
some, and it's fairly recent as well. So meaning that academics are taking an interest in this really important subject.
Absolutely. Point 121, the inquiry accepts that Jehovah's Witnesses did not live fully isolated lives, but evidence from former members indicates that there was, for some, a degree of disconnection or insularity from mainstream society. Oh, this was a little bit awkward for me, Chaka. It says, this is supported by the Faith's published guidance from 1971, which stated, do not be misled, bad associations spoil useful habits. Well, that's just a Bible verse.
Yeah, a bit of research wouldn't have gone amiss here, I think.
I would have said, I think that could have done with a little bit more work, that paragraph.
Exactly.
If I'm being, again, just brutally.
But the problem is, if you just go back a little bit, if you look at paragraph 120, the problem is that they argue things that they don't really have to argue. So in
Yeah.
paragraph 120, they're arguing that many current members live their lives fully integrated with society. I mean, I don't think I can agree with that. Obviously, you can go to work as a Jehovah's Witness, you can go to school, but there's outside of that, you're not really allowed to integrate with society in any meaningful way. So I think the problem is they were creating a lot of work for the inquiry because of arguing points that they didn't have to, which was just
but you know, credit to the inquiry for including these kind of rebuttals, or at least summarizing them at each and every point. Like you say, the organization's jumping through hoops to absolve itself. I think people can draw their own conclusions about that. But the inquiry, in order for its report to have some kind of weight to it, it needs to include these objections, and that's what it's doing. It's being as journalistic and thorough as it can be. Vetting, recruitment and training. There is no evidence of any secular vetting before Jehovah's Witness leaders or elders were appointed during the inquiry period. Instead, elders were appointed based on scriptural qualifications inspired by the Holy Spirit. There was also no secular training on child safety, safeguarding, or abuse prevention within the faith. Damning, but true.
Yeah. And it's just interesting that, again, they tried to counter-argue this, where they talked about like kingdom ministry schools and what was the one? We do have.
The point is
training.
secular training. It doesn't matter whether you can point to kingdom ministry schools and blah, blah, blah. It's secular training. So you have a responsibility to go to people outside of your organization who are experts on child protection and ask them for their input on how you should be dealing with this. It doesn't count for you to say, oh, we had this school and that school and this meeting and that meeting.
And this is the problem, as we've already highlighted, is that they're not open to any sort of criticism or feedback. They go into this thing with, we need to defend ourselves, we need to defend Jehovah's name, or whatever it is they want to defend, without being open to say, what areas can we improve in? And if they went in with that open mind, they would accept that this is actually a valid criticism, that there is experts who could give them some guidance, who could help them improve their policies, but nothing will change as long as they keep that attitude.
Absolutely. Continuing down, Mr. Mechen became an elder at 28 years old in 1995. Apologies if I've mispronounced. He was an elder for 12 years and told the inquiry there is no formally recognised training for elders in dealing appropriately with child sex abuse complaints, no psychology training or qualification requirement. The only training is in simple Jehovah's Witness procedure. There is nothing on mental health, drug abuse, or dealing with victims. Brutal, but honest. I think we can say.
Spot on. I think the Jehovah's Witnesses, it's probably a paragraph that you're going to come to. They make this argument of elders being trained to provide spiritual comfort or something like that. I don't remember. I was an elder for almost 10 years. I don't remember receiving any kind of training of how to give spiritual comfort to somebody who'd experienced child sexual abuse. So even in their own internal sort of doctrinal matters, they fail in their training.
And one shudders even to think of how any such kind of spiritual comfort pales in relevance compared to, psychological intervention,
Indeed.
and actual kind of intervention by people who know what they're doing,
Yes, absolutely.
Scrolling further down, inadequate vetting and training increases the risk I think we could go one further and say non-existent
True, true.
vetting and training, but again, they're being measured.
Hmm.
Inadequate vetting and training increases the risk of people in care being exposed to abuse. Without proper vetting, the potential exists for high-risk individuals to be given positions of responsibility where they can care for children or young people. Without adequate training, those in positions of authority can fail to act to prevent abuse or mishandle reports of alleged abuse. All these factors existed for the Jehovah's Witnesses during the inquiry period. Damning, isn't it?
It is damning. Yeah, and I like the fact that they've included that phrase of mishandling the reports of alleged abuse. Well, when you have somebody who's not trained, because even with the police, because I was assisting the police with a case that happened in a congregation, they send somebody who is specially trained to investigate, even at the investigation stage. They don't just send any officer, any random officer. So you have to have somebody who's got those skills. So somebody with the best of intentions could just mess it all up because they don't have the relevant training, qualifications, or experience.
Absolutely. Scrolling further down, we're now about three quarters of the way through the document. And this is actually quite harrowing, and I don't want to labour on this story too much because it is quite disturbing. But it's talking about an elder who would Miss SC's mother. Miss SC said the elder would drive me home after Bible studies in their home, but instead of going home, he took me to another area nearby where there were no houses or anything at that time. This was when the abuse took place. So this is detailing. I think the inquiry acknowledges that they have only one in part of their under their investigation. They have only one case of an elder abusing a Jehovah's Witness congregation member, and this is it. But as we're going to see in the language that they use, I think the language they use later on in the document is very deliberate in order to say there's almost certainly many more.
Exactly. Exactly.
But this was a really disturbing story. So yeah, it says, in addition to this one case, other children and young people were sexually abused within the Jehovah's Witness faith, although not clearly in care situations as defined in this inquiry. And then it says, the faith supplied information relating to sexual abuse by 4 elders. 1, an allegation that an elder took advantage of his position as an elder to abuse and rape a girl aged between 8 and 12 years old. 2, an elder developing an inappropriate relationship with a 15-year-old girl. 3, an elder engaging in sexual activity with a 15-year-old girl. And 4, an elder removed from office for inappropriate behaviour involving a minor. So what they're saying is, we know of one instance in our investigation where an elder, as part of Jehovah's Witness worship, raped a child, and the organisation has volunteered 4 other examples of where elders were involved, but this didn't happen as part of Jehovah's Witness worship, I think is what they're saying.
Yeah.
Correct me if I'm wrong.
I think you are on something there. It seems to me that it's because of the limited detail in the records regarding these 4 cases, the inquiry could not say this falls within our remit. So for example,
but this is where we needed what happened in Australia to happen, and again the records will be in Australia because Australia looks after New Zealand. But it's frustrating to know that it's definitely more than one. But there's just this, they can only go off people approaching, survivors having the courage to approach the inquiry directly. And I've spoken and interviewed enough survivors to know that just talking about abuse can be almost like reliving it, so it's really, really hard to find people who will come forward in that way. And so it seems that their only recourse was to then say to the organization, well, you must have some cases that you're not telling us that you don't know of any cases where elders abuse children. And the organization, it seems here, has been allowed to cherry pick instances where they've said, okay, well, we're going to throw these 4 elders under the bus and give you these 4 cases. They did a similar thing in ICSA. I'm not going to go into it, but they were allowed to heavily filter their records to come up with still a very alarming number of elders and servants who were not just abusers, but frankly still at large in the community,
Goodness.
But then in point 137 it says the records supplied were limited and it is not possible to be certain whether the children were abused in the care of the faith. So they're saying probably we can't rule out that they were actually involved in worship at that time. And the faith maintains that none of these children were in its care, and the evidence does not permit any clear conclusions. In summary, there is evidence of at least one case of sexual abuse in the care of the Jehovah's Witnesses during the inquiry period. Because of barriers to disclosure and the faith's approach to record keeping, this is unlikely to reflect the number of people who suffered sexual abuse in the care of the faith during that period. Again, very measured wording. It's exactly how they needed to write it, in my opinion.
Definitely, and you can kind of sense some kind of frustration here. I wonder whether they did approach the Australasia branch and try to sort of retrieve those records, but I think I'm pretty certain if they did, they card the Jehovah's Witnesses, Christian Congregation of Jehovah's Witnesses Australasia would have said would have been go to the congregations, knowing full well that the congregations do not hold any records because they've been instructed to destroy those records, and those records are kept in the database at the service department. So I think you could be here all year trying to get that because of the jurisdictional issues. So I think this is kind of frustration. If I had a frustration with the report, I would say I don't know how much they drilled into that, because even if they included that in the report and said, actually, there's evidence to suggest, we have an inkling that these records are kept abroad, and therefore we had difficulties accessing those records, I think that would have maybe just added a bit more to that aspect.
Yeah. I'm sure that there's a lot that the writers of this report would have liked to have said. But again, they're in this situation where they need to be as restrained and measured as they possibly can be. Van Shank Guitars, thank you so much for your super chat. Keep up the good work, Lloyd. Thank you so much. It's nice to see a black sheep, Jana, in the viewership. Jana was we were hoping to have her on the show, but unfortunately schedules did not permit. But it's nice to see her involved in some way. How do we show modesty? One way is by not demanding our own rights. Yeah, just quoting again what was said at the convention. The inquiry also included emotional and psychological abuse, not just child sexual abuse. Yeah, very important that it was doing that. Movie Man 96 says governments really just need to know that kids can be disfellowshipped or at least shunned if they do choose to celebrate birthdays. Children really have no choice and are threatened with Armageddon. Dominique Palanca says, agreed, I worked at an advocacy centre for child sexual abuse. They only allow questioning by trained advocates, prevent re-traumatization and preserve the integrity of the child's testimony. Yeah, let trained people be involved in this. Movie Man 96 says, also elders are so underqualified to be given the power they have over people. I guess that's what you get with no higher education or actual training to help people. And thank you so much to Super Chats from Lisa Burberry. Nice to see you again, Lisa. And Cheryl Sissom, another supporter of the channel there. So thank you so much to the 100 that are tuning in currently, and I'm sure there'll be many more watching after the live stream is over. I do have a few more points I wanted to kind of throw past you, Chaka. I'm aware that your time is valuable, so hopefully you can give me another 10-15 minutes.
I think we're fine. Yeah, we're absolutely fine. I'm actually earlier than you in time.
Yeah, that's true. It's later here.
You are in the future, Lloyd.
But both of us have served as elders, and we both know what it's like to go to an elders meeting and think it's going to be half an hour, and you emerge sort of 2 or 3 hours later thinking,
I'm so
so yeah, I think I was at this point noticing that there was quite a few points being repeated. So processes for handling and responding to concerns or complaints and their effectiveness. Yeah, so I was focused again, like I said, on the database. Let's talk about the database. And in point 156, this is talking about the judicial committee process. Former members found the investigation and judicial committee process to be traumatizing. Witnesses told the inquiry that at the investigative meetings, they were required to describe in detail the sexual abuse they had experienced to a group of elders, all male, some with their abuser present at that meeting, but no support person or parent. They were fearful and intimidated by this practice. These meetings were often arranged quickly with no warning to the child or young person. Again, the policies changed slightly in recent years. Maybe if we're being ultra critical, it would have been nice to kind of note that in this paragraph, but nonetheless, this is actually what happened, and it's good to see this being highlighted in this way.
Yeah, it's good to have it documented.
Yeah. Now we get on to the two-witness rule. There was the funny point where it said, it says, so it says this rule sometimes referred to as the two-person rule. I've never heard it referred to as the two-person rule.
Yeah, I saw that and I did wonder about that. I was like, where did that come from?
Who's calling it the two-person rule? I want to meet them, But anyway, that's just being hypercritical. Point 160, in practice, the two-witness rule meant an abuser would face no consequences unless they committed the abuse in front of another person or another witness came forward and reported similar conduct by the abuser. That is absolutely spot on accurate. The policy stated in the more recent handbook, Shepherd the Flock of God, appeared to reflect an ongoing hesitation to accept the evidence of children and young people. And this ties in with what I was saying earlier about inconsistencies, because the organization is saying we never interview young people as part of the judicial process.
Yes.
And yet here we have a quote that says the testimony of youths may be considered. It is up to the elders to determine whether the testimony has the ring of truth, whatever that means. It's such a weird... This is surely, Chaka, something that's going to get eliminated from future Shepherd the Flock of God books, because it's so arbitrary, isn't it? Who gets the final word? What relevance does it have whether it has the ring of truth or not? Either it's true or it's not true.
Exactly.
And what they're actually saying here is that the testimony of children has a lesser value and should be viewed with more skepticism.
Yeah, that's exactly what they're saying, and that obviously this skepticism would then deter people from reporting. And I think you're right in saying in future they may reevaluate this because these rules are just so arbitrary.
It's
So they've
silly.
got,
It's
yeah,
silly wording. Does it
it
have the
is.
ring of truth? What does that mean?
Yeah,
Who gets to decide on
exactly.
what has the ring or truth? It's like
Yeah,
some kind of fantasy novel language. Does he have the ring of truth? The bearer of the ring of truth has spoken.
indeed. Yeah,
It's so
but
silly. Yeah.
it is silly. But the thing is, like, if you look further in that same paragraph, they talk about the testimony of unbelievers and disfellowshipped or disassociated ones. So you basically got this hierarchy of testimony. So you've got an elder, obviously his testimony trumps the testimony of just a publisher. And then you've got somebody who's baptized in good standing, that their evidence trumps the evidence of somebody who's not in good standing. Then you've got a youth, then you've got a disfellowshipped or disassociated person. So you could even have a situation where somebody's testimony was valid yesterday because they were still in the congregation, and today they've disassociated and their testimony is no longer valid. So yeah.
Again, if I'm being hypercritical, I would have liked them to have connect this statement with the denial that was issued
Yes.
earlier in the document. But you can't have everything. It's still a fantastic report. This reflected the reality during the inquiry period that evidence from anyone other than an adult Jehovah's Witnesses member was treated with caution, making it difficult to reach the threshold of sufficient evidence to call a judicial committee. This inevitably undermined the response of the faith to abuse in care.
It's a good paragraph.
Absolutely. So we have a former elder saying, in my experience, this is a faith that does not like scrutiny and is not transparent. Given that the members are so subservient, it is the ideal playground for deviants. As the saying goes, a wolf in sheep's clothing. Brutal but honest. You can't fault that.
Yeah.
Lack of reporting to external authorities. Former Jehovah's Witnesses said that during the inquiry period, complaints and concerns of abuse were not often reported to secular authorities. Parents and survivors typically reported abuse directly to the elders rather than to any secular authority. Elders handled these reports internally without any training and did not usually involve police. Naomi Burnett said there was no mention of going to the police and reporting this to the authorities. It was dealt with in-house. Involving the authorities would bring shame to Jehovah. It would shame the religion. This is the reasoning for the Jehovah's Witness religion intentionally concealing crimes like this from the police. Absolutely spot on.
That is very accurate.
Very accurate. And I would have just liked a little bit more emphasis on this fact that the organization sets itself as a gatekeeper between the those involved in the case and the police.
Yes.
So we're going to decide who knows what and when they know it. And,
Exactly.
and it's one thing to say, as they do now in the Watchtower, we remind parents that it is their right to go to the police, but we heard them say in this year's convention, no less, modesty involves not insisting on your rights.
Yeah.
So former elder Shane Metchen is quoted as saying the police are seen as evil and under Satan's control.
Yeah, I would have loved a bit of nuance to.
I think
to
a
that.
bit more nuance would have
Yeah.
been welcome there, but it's the sort of thing where, again, a Jehovah's Witness scrolling through this could say, well, there's an apostate who's just telling lies to try and make us look bad. Particularly because of this practice of rarely, and it could be, just to come to Shane's defense, it could be that his full statement had more nuance, but
True.
it could be that it's just the way his words have been kind of edited. Particularly because of this practice of rarely reporting abuse to police, being in the Jehovah's Witnesses sometimes gave abusers additional protection, and a place to hide. This is again the point at which I was just scouring the document, thinking, talk about the database, but they don't really talk about it that much. Jehovah's Witnesses official guidance on child sexual abuse requires elders to report to secular authorities if the victim or another minor is still in danger of abuse. I don't think that's accurate, actually. I think that if you actually read the full wording, it's again the organization who decides.
Exactly. It's whether the discretion.
And they say that they will allow elders to report if they consider that the victim or another minor is still in danger of abuse. So I take issue with that wording. I think that
basically what I think you're right on that, Lloyd. And I think I was quite surprised in how little the service department and the legal department have mentioned in this document.
Yes.
I think they're mentioned once, as far as I remember.
It's not just me.
I remember, it was the one time towards the end that they were mentioned.
It feels like pretty much the first half of the document is given over to dismantling this myth that Jehovah's Witnesses shouldn't be accountable to inquiries like this because they don't look after children in faith settings, when clearly they do. And then by the time they're done with all of that, it leaves them with not as much to talk about. And I feel as though the database is, the two witness rule is important, obviously. Establishing culpability, very important. But, that database is just sitting there, and it needs to be talked about,
Exactly. Yeah.
The inquiry has not seen any evidence of the Jehovah's Witnesses referring sexual abuse allegations to police during the inquiry period in Aotearoa, New Zealand. This is consistent with inquiry findings in Australia and the United Kingdom. That is a very terse, blunt statement, but again, very, very damning, isn't it?
It is very damning.
You would think that a responsible, respectable organisation would be able to say to the inquiry, here are examples of where we've involved the police in abuse, but for all of their jumping up and down and litigating against this inquiry, the Jehovah's Witnesses had an opportunity to do that and say, look, here's what we've, they could have come up with, like, I'm sure, one or two examples of where one way or another the police got involved early on and they played some part in it, but they haven't been able to do that at all in this inquiry.
Yeah, and even the 5 examples we have. So we have the one where the witness submitted their testimony, and then we have the 4 that the organization volunteered. Even out of those 5, there isn't even one example where it's been reported to the police. So indeed. It's really disappointing.
So this is, I've just highlighted this footnote, and you know what, if I can just say, I don't want to bang on about ICSA too much. I was a core participant to that inquiry back in 2019. It did eat up weeks and weeks of work of me sitting down in the bunker on my laptop, surrounded by books, and writing pages and pages and pages of evidence. And if you will allow me to summarize, the inquiry was a damp squib. The findings were nowhere near robust enough, and it was such a farce that the inquiry as a whole, not just Jehovah's Witnesses, but the whole kind of inquiry, because it spanned Church of England, it spanned non-religious settings as well. The inquiry was such a farce that the government did nothing with it.
Yeah, and then
it was on the news, wasn't it? That Professor Alexis Jay was kind of jumping up and down saying, "But why aren't you doing anything with the inquiry that I chaired, because
Yes.
Professor Alexis J, you watered down your findings so much that the government couldn't do anything with them.
Yeah, and I think this is one thing that I'm really impressed with this New Zealand inquiry, because even in their recommendation, their recommendations, they just go, this has to be done, this has to be implemented. They're not wishy-washy about it. They don't water it down, because uh, inevitably these things will go into parliament. There will be debates, and there will be things, and there will be amendments, and those things. So you want to make it so that even when those things happen, when those changes are made by the decision makers, at least some meaningful effect comes from it. But if you're starting off from a position where it's already watered down, then there's just nothing that's going to be implemented from it.
If you're a legislator, if you're an elected representative, and you've got constituents, banging on about their utility bills, banging on about, potholes and, people not collecting the waste, so you've got all of this noise going on.
Yes.
And then you're being asked to kind of look at this other subject. What you need is someone to step forward and say, this is really, really serious, and this is why.
Exactly.
And ultimately, ICSA completely failed to do that. So that if I were an MP and I were looking at the findings, I think, well, nothing to see here.
Exactly.
I'll get back to fixing the potholes.
There's far more serious issues.
But having said all that, as someone who did chew up so much time away from my children, and wasn't paid for it or anything like that, it was just all done on like a completely volunteer basis. And I'm going to try not to get emotional. It feels really, really nice that at least the New Zealand inquiry is taking that, at least some of those findings, and including them. It feels like it wasn't a complete waste of time. Yeah,
it must be very validating for you.
Very, very validating is what I'm saying. Yeah. Record keeping practices during the inquiry period. Creating and retaining accurate records of abuse allegations is fundamental to preventing and responding to abuse in care, as well as redress processes. Incomplete, inaccessible, or inaccurate records can make it difficult for an organisation to know whether someone has previously committed or been accused of sexual abuse and is a safeguarding risk. Without sufficient and accurate information about past behaviour, an organisation cannot ensure it responds appropriately to risk. In addition, for many survivors of abuse in care, the first step in seeking closure is to request records from the institution. If it is difficult to do so, this can be traumatic for survivors. Here's what I think is happening here, Chaka, and you can correct me. Please correct me if you think I'm wrong. Again, I don't think Jehovah's Witnesses have a problem when it comes to collecting data on abuse.
No.
I think that our last JW Watch episode established that very, very well, that they are meticulous in finding out the who, what, where, and when of what happened. I think what's happened here is they've gone to the organisation and said, do you mind giving us your records? We're not going to rush in and grab them like the ARC did, but we're just asking you nicely. And I think the organisation's saying, you know what, we don't really have anything, and so the inquiry is saying, well, that itself is not good enough.
Yeah, that's it.
I think that's what they're saying here. But you and I know the truth is that they do have records.
Exactly. I think with a little bit more digging, they could have established the fact that even if, and I know what we're saying about sort of trying to make it as professional as possible, but even if they just acknowledge the fact that those records are overseas, and then that creates that difficulty in obtaining them, I think it would have added a bit more weight to it, and also it would have made their organization look more culpable.
So this kind of leads them to, I guess, the only conclusion that they can draw, which is the approach of the Jehovah's Witnesses to record keeping of allegations of abuse was mixed at best during the inquiry period. Again, you have that measured language. Former elder Shane Metchan described the position for judicial committees in the 1990s. Elders take personal notes, but these are later destroyed. A judicial committee would send a blue envelope to the Auckland Bethel, and it would be kept in their database. There would be a record of the perpetrator and what he's done to prove he's sorry. The thing is, there's the blue envelope. There's the summary of the disfellowshipping or the reproof. But what's not taken into account here is the fact that, again, you have this document that is literally a form that gets filled in, and it's filled in by if I'm not mistaken, the branch, and that can have details that reflect at least what happened, or at least the substance of what's in the elders' notes. Would that be fair to say?
I think that's accurate. In terms of when I was involved in the process, as a judicial committee, we filled in that form.
Because you have first-hand knowledge of this whole process. You've been part of a child sexual abuse investigation in a Jehovah's Witness context. Yeah,
but there was explicit instructions to forward that to the branch as soon as it was filled in. In fact, they expected it to be within the night of the judicial committee and then forwarded to the branch. And then the explicit instructions was then to destroy that record. It wasn't just a case of just destroying the filled in form. Even the actual form had to be destroyed so that the congregation basically had no record. So what then happens is that if you wanted to find out, if a few years down the line something came up with this perpetrator and you needed information, you'd have to call the branch so that they could spell out what that individual did. So the records definitely are there, but they're not just kept by the congregations. And I think the difficulty that the New Zealand inquiry ran into is, I think they probably approached some of the congregations where some of these names were associated with, and what they found is that in the congregations there were not no records which would be in line with the current policy. So I think if they sort of drilled a bit deeper in that, they would have found that difficulty, but we have to acknowledge their fantastic efforts.
Yeah, absolutely. So I promise you I'm going to get to the end of this and my notes here. The approach of the Jehovah's Witnesses appeared to rely on a brief summary document being retained with the notes of the elders on judicial committees being destroyed. That alone is a damning statement that they're destroying essentially criminal evidence.
Indeed.
The inquiry's review of the records the Jehovah's Witnesses provided, so they did provide some records, indicates the types of brief summary retained by the faith were inadequate to ensure sufficient information was available to inform proper decision making. And then it gives some examples of where they kind of just glossed over the seriousness of what happened.
Again, because they're looking in the wrong place. I'm pretty certain. Like I would like somebody to come, maybe in the comments and say that's true. But I'm pretty certain they've looked in the congregations, and it's in the congregations where you have a brief summary. It's not at the branch. The branch has all the details. I was in a congregation where I literally rang the service department to find out about an abuser, and this guy just spelled out everything, like dates, names, everything. And we didn't have that in the congregation file. So they probably said, go to this congregation, they're going to assist you. And in the congregation, there's just like a one or two one-liner.
And I cannot express to you enough how much it enrages me, Chaka, and I'm sure you feel the same way, that this information is just sitting there on servers in Chelmsford and in Warwick, in Patterson most likely, and the authorities can't do anything about it. You know, it
is frustrating, and it's because of the deception on the part of the Jehovah's Witness leadership.
The combination of the Jehovah's Witnesses practices as described above and the records the inquiry has reviewed indicate an inadequate approach to the documenting and retention of information about illegal cases of abuse. The information documented and retained did not provide an adequate basis for well-informed, risk-based decision-making to ensure the safety of children and young people in the care of the faith. Again, I just would disagree slightly. I think the cover-up of abuse is perhaps eluding the inquiry a little bit. That they are very good at retaining information and documenting
Indeed.
it. It's just that they're withholding it, which is kind of the whole point. Conclusions on steps by the Jehovah's Witnesses to prevent and respond to the risk of abuse in care. The investigation and judicial committee process was rigid, inappropriate, and daunting for victims of abuse, with limited flexibility and very little consideration for the trauma or support needs of the victim, and has likely prevented other disclosures of abuse. Now, I'm not going to go through it for time because this has already gone on longer than I wanted it to, but I did mention ICSA. And I do like, I love the fact that this inquiry has amalgamated or brought in the findings of the Royal Commission into institutional responses to child abuse, sexual abuse in Australia. And it's also brought in so there is a kind of a summary of the main bullet points from the ARC. And it's also, if I scroll down further, it's also brought in the ICSA. It's mentioned there, the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse.
It has
and which again, as I said, was I'm going to just say it was a disservice to children. I believe that the way that the evidence given by not just myself but many other current and many other former Jehovah's Witnesses and victims, the way it was kind of glossed over, and the way that Paul Gillies was allowed to monopolise on the inquiry's time during the actual hearings, was not just a disservice to children. It resulted in findings that couldn't be acted upon, and therefore the inquiry made itself complicit in future abuse of children.
Exactly.
That's just how I feel. I feel like they're complicit.
And you're absolutely right to feel that way. And it's they've been too trusting to the Jehovah's Witnesses and not really subjected them to the proper scrutiny they should have.
Indeed. So I think that's more or less, so then we're at the summary of findings. So that's kind of pretty much the main talking points, I feel, from what is an excellent report, an excellent case study into Jehovah's Witnesses. I love the fact that it brought in the ARC and ICSA. I love the fact that it quoted from academic research that neither of us even knew existed.
That was brilliant. That was fantastic.
I think it's laid down a benchmark in completely dismantling the myth that Jehovah's Witnesses aren't involved in care of children in the context of their worship. That's just been completely eviscerated, I feel, in this document. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I 100% agree with those thoughts, and my hope is that future inquiries like this or commissions will do something similar, as in build on the work that has been done already. So we've already got the Australian Royal Commission, ICSA, and now we've got this fantastic report from this inquiry. And if other countries are going to do something similar, then that database will just keep increasing. And the other thing I just wanted to comment on very, very briefly, if you allow me to, Lloyd.
Sure, yeah, absolutely.
There is also on this website that's on the banner, there is the recommendations from this inquiry. And one of the recommendations stated very explicitly is that the governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses should apologize to all the survivors of abuse. So I thought that was fantastic. The other thing they've recommended is that organizations, including faith-based organizations, should get accreditations, and the accreditations will be based on whether they have training for people in authority in the context of Jehovah's Witnesses, that would be elders. And this training has to be regular. So they've suggested a yearly basis. And not only that, you also would have to be supervised by somebody who's not connected to the religion. So someone like an external supervisor. And they're saying in the recommendations, they're saying that if people fail to adhere to these standards, then they could impose penalties, which could include revoking the charitable status. So we don't know how many of those recommendations will be implemented, but potentially you're looking at, if the Jehovah's Witnesses continue not to cooperate, you're looking at them losing their charitable status in a serious country like New Zealand. So that's quite interesting to see how this all unfolds.
So we've had inquiries now in England and Wales, in Australia, in New Zealand. We're just waiting, I guess, for the next one. We've got the Pennsylvania grand jury investigation ongoing, and we've got all the pressure from the Norwegian government. So it's an exciting time. I mean, I still feel in my gut that I'm not going to be around to see the Death Star explode. But it's a really interesting time, and I'm sure even though it goes nowhere near giving any kind of closure to survivors and their horrendous experience, hopefully it's at least a little bit of positivity to know that some people are taking this seriously and some people do care, you know.
It is. And just to add to that list of countries you mentioned, we've also got Lithuania, who have actually revoked the legal entity, the status of the legal entity in that country. And then you've got Japan also drilling into the organization. So it's building up. It's building up gradually.
And it has to happen. I mean, you know, this is a dangerous organization, and they've, in my opinion, been able to hide behind religious deference for way too long. And I feel as though the more time passes and the more, dare I say it, secularism is adhered to, or the principles of secularism, it's almost inevitable that governments will take these actions. So,
indeed.
Chaka, look, I really appreciate you taking the time to go over this document with me, and I think your insights have been wonderful. So, can I just thank you, one activist to another, and also it's very heartening on a personal note to see the journey that you're on. And, you know, like someone said in the comments early on in this live stream, you know, you've already been, you know, instrumental in helping people to, you know, deconstruct the Jehovah's Witness cult control. So well done. Keep up the good work. And it's been an absolute thrill to have you on the show.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on the channel. It's a really important subject that probably is not talked about. I think we talk about it, but we can still talk about it and just bring this to the attention of people either in the Jehovah's Witness community, ex-JW community, secular authorities, and so on. And it's good to be part of this movement and trying to contribute, because I think we can all make a difference, no matter how small that difference is.
Well said. Okay, so viewers, I hope you have enjoyed our show. Don't forget to subscribe to the Lloyd Evans channel for future shows, but that's all we have time for. Thank you so much for watching. Take care.